The Nile does not merely flow, it breathes, carries within its waters the rhythm of seasons older than memory, brings life to sand that would otherwise hold only silence and bone, and the emptiness that the desert offers to those who venture too far from the water's edge, who leave behind the green ribbon where life concentrates and enter the red land where nothing grows except the occasional acacia surviving on moisture too deep for human reach. The river descends from hidden sources in the highlands of East Africa, where the rains fall and gather into tributaries that merge into the White Nile flowing from Lake Victoria and the Blue Nile flowing from the Ethiopian highlands, each bringing its particular gift, the White Nile bringing consistent flow throughout the year, the Blue Nile bringing the summer floods that ancient Egypt depended upon completely, that arrived with such regularity that the Egyptians organized their calendar around the inundation. That made agriculture possible through the silt deposited when the waters receded, that renewed the fields annually, that transformed what would have been desert into the most productive agricultural zone in the ancient world. It is said that the Nile flows backward, that it defies natural order by flowing from south to north rather than from north to south as rivers should flow, that it demonstrates through its unusual direction that Egypt is a special place where the normal rules do not apply, where the river brings flood without rain falling from Egyptian skies, where the water arrives as if summoned by invisible hands, where everything about the river reinforces the Egyptian belief that they lived in favored land. In place chosen by the gods, in territory where divine order operated more perfectly than elsewhere, where Ma'at, the cosmic balance, the proper ordering of things was more fully realized than in the chaotic lands beyond Egypt's borders where people did not have the Nile, where agriculture depended on unpredictable rains, where life was harder and less secure and less ordered than in Egypt where the river provided, where the flood came. Where abundance was assured if the proper rituals were performed, and if the pharaoh fulfilled his duties, and if the relationship between humans and gods remained balanced. Beneath the silence of the annual flood that rose without warning falling from the sky, no rain fell in most of Egypt. The moisture came from distant highlands that most Egyptians never saw, that existed beyond their knowledge, that made the flood seem miraculous, seem like divine gift rather than meteorological phenomenon. We can sense why the ancients believed the Nile was divine. Was the physical manifestation of Hapi, the god of inundation, who was depicted as androgynous figure with pendulous breasts and swollen belly suggesting fertility and abundance, who brought the flood that made Egypt possible, who was honored with hymns that praised his generosity, that begged him to arrive on time and in proper measure, that recognized that too little water meant famine and too much water meant destruction of levees and drowning of fields. That the relationship with Hapi required attention and prayer and proper behavior, required maintaining Ma'at so that the god would continue to bless Egypt with the flood that sustained everything. The river was simultaneously highway and boundary highway that connected Upper Egypt in the south with Lower Egypt in the north, that allowed boats to travel downstream with the current and upstream with the prevailing north winds that filled their sails, that made transportation easier in Egypt than in most ancient civilizations where goods had to be moved over land by human porters or by pack animals. That allowed the massive stone blocks for pyramids and temples to be quarried in Aswan and floated hundreds of miles downstream to building sites at Giza and Saqqara and elsewhere. That created unified kingdom out of what might have remained fragmented regions if not for the river that connected them. and boundary that separated the black land, the Kemet, the fertile soil deposited by the flood from the red land, the desert. The desert that extended east and west from the river, that was the realm of Set, the god of chaos and violence. That was where the dead were buried because the desert's dryness preserved bodies. That was simultaneously threatening and essential, hostile and useful, the opposite of the black land but also its necessary complement, the chaos beyond order that made order precious. The death beyond life that made life sweet. Where memory fades into the question of what Egypt would have been without the Nile, whether civilization would have emerged from the sand, or whether the temples and pyramids and all the monuments that speak of Egyptian greatness would never have been conceived by people struggling to survive in desert landscape without reliable water source, without the agricultural surplus that the river's annual gift created, without the transportation network that the river provided. Without the security that came from living in land that was naturally protected by desert on both sides and by cataracts in the south and by Mediterranean Sea in the north, that was difficult to invade and easy to defend, that could develop without the constant warfare that characterized other regions, that could focus its energies on building and on elaborating religious practices and on creating monuments rather than on defending borders, we find the Nile as the essential answer, as the reason, as the singular explanation for everything that followed, the cities that clustered along its banks, the fields that depended on its flooding, the boats that carried goods and gods and the dead toward their eternal destinations, the papyrus that grew in its marshes and that would become the medium for preserving thought and law and prayer and story. The Egyptians understood their dependence on the river, created religion and mythology that explained the flood and that provided rituals for ensuring its continuation, developed technology for measuring the water's height through nilometers that allowed prediction of flood's magnitude, created administrative systems for managing irrigation and for allocating water to fields, built temples to honor the river and the gods who controlled it, organized their entire civilization around the recognition that the Nile was not just physical feature of geography but was living presence, was divine gift, was the foundation upon which everything else rested, was the reason Egypt existed and the explanation for Egypt's prosperity and the source of Egypt's power and the guarantee of Egypt's future as long as the relationship between Egyptians and the river remained properly ordered, as long as Ma'at was maintained. As long as the pharaoh performed his duties and the people fulfilled their obligations and the gods continued to smile upon the black land, upon Egypt, upon the narrow green ribbon where life flourished. The river that flows through eternity flows still, diminished by dams and diversions but still recognizable, still the Nile that made Egypt possible, still carrying within its current the memory of everything it nourished, everything it created, everything it witnessed across 5,000 years of Egyptian history, the first farmers planting seeds in silt deposited by the flood, the first pharaohs unifying Upper and Lower Egypt into single kingdom, the pyramid builders transporting blocks down the river, the priests performing rituals on its banks, the dead being ferried across to the western shore where the sun set and where the realm of the dead lay, the armies using it to move troops and supplies, the traders carrying goods from the Mediterranean to Nubia and back, the entire pageant of Egyptian civilization unfolding along the river's length, dependent on its gift, structured by its rhythms, made possible by its generosity, sustained by the annual flood that arrived with such regularity that it became the organizing principle of Egyptian time, the calendar based on the inundation rather than on the solar year, the seasons defined by the flood Akhit, the inundation season, Peret the growing season when the fields were planted and cultivated. Shemu the harvest season when the grain was gathered, 3 seasons repeating annually, creating pattern that lasted for millennia, that structured Egyptian life. That made the river not just water flowing through landscape, but time made visible, eternity made tangible, the cosmic order made manifest through the regular cycling of flood and harvest, through the reliable generosity of Happy who brought the waters, through the Nile that flows through eternity. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the Nile speaks still through its waters that continue to flow north from the highlands through the desert to the Mediterranean, through the fields that still grow crops using water from the river, even though the Aswan Dam has ended the annual flood, through the temples and tombs that line its banks testifying to the civilization that the river created, through the hieroglyphs that record prayers and hymns to Happy and to the river itself, through everything that preserves the Egyptian recognition that the Nile was divine. Was essential was the gift that made everything possible, that made Egypt the civilization of the Nile, that made the river flow through eternity carrying life and memory, and the voices of all who lived along its banks, who depended on its flood, who honored its divinity, who created in the space between the desert and the river one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Ancient Egypt, the land of the Nile, the black land sustained by the river that flows through eternity, that flows still. That carries still the memory of what Egypt was, that speaks still about the river and the civilization, about the flood and the harvest, about Happy and the pharaohs, about the temples and the fields, about everything that depended on the Nile, about the river that flows through eternity, that made Egypt eternal, that flows still through time and memory, through the desert landscape, through the monuments that survive, through the voices that speak from hieroglyphs and from papyrus. Through the recognition that Egypt was and is the civilization of the Nile, the gift of the river, the creation of the flood, the testimony to what water can do when it flows through desert, bringing life, bringing abundance, bringing the annual miracle that made ancient Egypt possible, that made the Nile flow through eternity. At Giza, where 3 massive geometries rise from the plateau like mountains that mathematics built, like diagrams of cosmic order made tangible through stone blocks numbered in the millions, and arranged with precision that seems impossible given the tools that Bronze Age Egypt possessed, like frozen moments of perfect proportion and alignment that speak of knowledge both practical and esoteric, both engineering and theology, both human capability and divine inspiration. The pyramids stand as testaments to belief so profound that it moved nations to labor for decades, that convinced generations to quarry and transport and lift and position limestone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each, with some blocks weighing 15 tons or more, that focused the entire resources of Egyptian civilization toward creating eternal houses for kings who would become gods, who would sail across the sky with Ra, and who required vessels worthy of their divine transformation, who needed pyramids as launching pads for their journey to the stars, as stairways to heaven, as representations of the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at creation, and from which the sun god first rose. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, covers 13 acres at its base, rose originally to height of 481 feet, though weathering and loss of its limestone casing has reduced it to 455 feet, was the tallest human-made structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years, until medieval cathedrals finally exceeded it. Was built with such precision that its base is level to within less than an inch despite its massive size. that its sides are aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal directions with deviation of less than 4 minutes of arc, that its internal passages and chambers demonstrate knowledge of geometry and astronomy and engineering that continues to impress modern architects and engineers who study the structure trying to understand how it was built with the tools available to 4th Dynasty Egypt. It is said that the Great Pyramid contains chambers whose purposes remain disputed even after centuries of study, that the Grand Gallery with its corbelled ceiling and its precise angles serves functions that we can describe but not fully explain, that the so-called King's Chamber with its massive granite sarcophagus and its air shafts that point toward specific stars demonstrates astronomical knowledge encoded in architecture. That the entire structure is simultaneously tomb and temple and time capsule and message, simultaneously practical structure designed to protect royal burial and symbolic structure designed to proclaim royal divinity, to connect earth and heaven, to serve as resurrection machine that would ensure the pharaoh's transformation from mortal king to immortal god. Beneath the silence of the burial chambers stripped long ago by thieves who violated the sacred spaces seeking the gold and jewelry that were buried with pharaohs, who broke through sealed passages and smashed through granite plugs that were meant to protect the burial, who left behind only the stone sarcophagi too heavy to remove and the hieroglyphic texts inscribed on walls in later pyramids, the pyramid texts that are humanity's oldest religious writings. That provide spells and instructions for the deceased pharaoh's journey through the underworld, that testify to the elaborate theology that justified and explained the pyramid's purpose. We can imagine what these spaces held when they were sealed, when the king's mummy lay surrounded by everything needed for the afterlife, when the breath of the living was sealed inside with the breath of the newly dead, when the pyramid became bridge between this world and the next, became the vehicle for royal resurrection. The construction of the Great Pyramid probably required 20 years and a workforce that varied seasonally larger during the inundation season, when farmers could not work their fields and could be mobilized for pyramid construction, smaller during planting and harvest seasons when agricultural labor was essential. The workers were not slaves as popular imagination often assumes, but were paid laborers who received rations of bread and beer and vegetables, who lived in workers' villages whose remains have been excavated near the pyramid sites, who were organized into teams that competed with each other, who left graffiti on the stones they placed boasting about their crew's accomplishments, who built the pyramids as religious duty and as economic opportunity, and as national project that employed thousands and that demonstrated Egypt's wealth and power and organizational capability. Where memory fades into the question of what the pyramid builders understood about their work, whether the laborers who hauled the stones up ramps that have not survived or that were dismantled after the pyramid's completion knew they were creating wonder that would outlast empires, whether they believed in the divine mission they were fulfilling, or whether they simply fulfilled obligations to their king and their gods without fully comprehending the theological significance of what they built. Whether they saw themselves as participants in sacred work or as workers doing difficult job for wages, we find the pyramids as ambiguous monuments, testaments to faith and to power, to devotion and to compulsion, to human capability and to human mortality, to the desire to defeat death through stone permanence. To create structures that would preserve not just the king's body but his ka, his life force, and his ba, his personality or soul, and his name, his identity that would live as long as his name was spoken, as long as his pyramid stood proclaiming his existence. The pyramids at Giza, Khufu's Great Pyramid, flanked by the pyramids of his son Khafre and his grandson Menkaure, surrounded by smaller pyramids for queens and by mastaba tombs for nobles and officials who wanted to be buried near their pharaohs, guarded by the Sphinx that we will encounter in later chapter, create necropolis that is simultaneously cemetery and sacred landscape, simultaneously place of death and place of resurrection, simultaneously ending and beginning, simultaneously tomb and temple and testament to the Old Kingdom's power and to its beliefs about death and afterlife and the transformation that awaited the righteous dead, that was guaranteed to pharaohs who had performed their duties properly, who had maintained Ma'at during their reigns, who had built their pyramids and prepared their burials and ensured through proper ritual and proper preservation that they would live again. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the pyramids speak through their silence, through their mass, through their precision, through their survival across 4 to 5 centuries. Through the questions they continue to pose: how were they built with such accuracy using tools that seem inadequate to the task? Why were they built with such enormous expenditure of resources and labor? What did they mean to those who built them? What do they mean to us who study them and marvel at them and argue about them? Who propose theories ranging from the conventional to the wildly speculative? Who see in the pyramids everything from simple tombs to encoded repositories of advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge, to monuments built by or with assistance from non-human intelligences, the pyramids that have become screens onto which we project our own desires for mystery and for connection to the ancient past. Our own needs to believe that ancient peoples were either wiser or more mysterious than conventional scholarship acknowledges. The pyramids that hold the breath of kings hold it still in the emptied chambers where tourists now walk with flashlights and cameras, in the violated sarcophagi that once contained royal mummies, in the passages that echo with footsteps instead of with prayers, in the stones that remain precisely positioned even when everything else has been taken, in the geometry that still speaks of order and permanence and the human determination to build what will last. To create monuments that will speak across millennia about what Egypt valued: eternal life, divine kingship, cosmic order, the defeat of death through preservation and prayer, through building pyramids that would stand forever, through holding the breath of kings who believed they would breathe again, who built houses of eternity to ensure their resurrection, who speak now through the pyramids that hold their memory, that hold their names carved in hieroglyphs, that hold the spaces where they lay in the darkness waiting for the moment when Ba and Ka would reunite with mummified flesh and they would live again, would sail with Ra, would become stars, would be eternal. The breath held in stone, in pyramid, in the geometry that rises from Giza, that speaks still about kings and breath and stone and eternity, about the pyramids that hold the breath of kings. In the cool darkness of temple sanctuaries and tomb chambers, where sunlight never penetrates except through carefully positioned openings designed to illuminate specific reliefs at specific times of year, where oil lamps flickered and created shadows that made the carved figures seem to move, to breathe, to participate in the rituals that were depicted on the walls in endless repetition: the pharaoh making offerings, the gods receiving offerings. The cycle of service and blessing that define the relationship between divine and human realms. Hieroglyphs cover every surface like sacred skin, like the visible manifestation of thought and prayer and theology, like language that was simultaneously writing system and art form, simultaneously phonetic script that recorded sounds and ideographic system that represented concepts, simultaneously practical tool for recording information and magical technology for making thought powerful. For making words effective beyond mere communication, for creating reality through inscription, because to write a thing was to make it exist, to inscribe a prayer was to ensure it would be heard eternally, to carve a god's name was to invoke divine presence. The hieroglyphs, the sacred carvings, as the Greeks called them, were gifts from Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing and the moon, the divine scribe who recorded the judgment of the dead in the hall of Maat, who knew all languages including the secret language of magic, who had given writing to humanity as tool and as sacred trust, who made scribes into priests and made literacy into power, because those who could read and write the hieroglyphs could access knowledge that was closed to the illiterate majority, could read the spells that protected and empowered, could write the inscriptions that would endure beyond their lifetimes, could participate in the divine creative power that made the world through speaking it, through naming it, through writing it into existence. It is said that there were 3 scripts in ancient Egypt, the hieroglyphs themselves used for sacred inscriptions on temple walls and tomb chambers and monuments. The hieratic script, that was cursive form of hieroglyphs used for religious texts on papyrus and for administrative documents, and the demotic script that developed later and was used for everyday purposes, but all 3 derived from the hieroglyphs. All 3 were connected to the sacred original. All 3 partook of the power that writing possessed in Egyptian thought, the power to make permanent what was temporary, to give voice to silence, to preserve thought beyond the thinker's death, to create reality through inscription, to bridge the gap between the visible and the invisible, between the mortal and the immortal, between time and eternity. Beneath the silence of the signs that show birds and baskets and water ripples and human figures and lions and snakes and hands and eyes and thousands of other images, each representing sound or concept or both simultaneously depending on context, each carefully carved or painted by scribes who understood that mistakes could be dangerous, that to incorrectly write a god's name could be offense that would bring punishment, that to omit required elements from a spell could render it ineffective. That hieroglyphs were not merely decorative or informational but were functional, were active, were alive in ways that modern writing is not alive, were empowered through the act of inscription to do what they described, to create what they named, to make real what they depicted. We can sense the worldview that saw language as magic, that understood writing as creation, that believed the Book of the Dead inscribed in tombs would actually guide the deceased through the underworld's dangers, that the spells written on papyrus and placed as amulets on the mummy would actually protect against demons and dangers, that words properly written would endure beyond the speaker's death and would continue to act, to create, to manifest the realities they described. The hieroglyphs were not just read but were also feared and respected, and sometimes deliberately damaged. The images of snakes might be shown cut in half so they could not harm the tomb's occupant. The images of humans or animals might be shown with their bodies separated from their heads or with crucial features missing so they could not come to life and attack. The names of enemies might be written and then ritually destroyed so that the enemies themselves would be destroyed. The entire system operating on the principle that the representation and the reality were connected, that to affect one was to affect the other, that magic worked through correspondence and that writing was the technology that made correspondence powerful, that allowed humans to manipulate reality through manipulating its symbolic representations, through writing and unwriting, through inscribing and erasing, through the hieroglyphs that spoke in sacred silence. where memory fades into the centuries after Egypt was conquered and absorbed into the Roman Empire, after the old religion was suppressed and the temples were closed, and the priests who could read the hieroglyphs died without passing on their knowledge because there was no one left to teach. Because Christianity and later Islam replaced the old religion and had no use for the sacred script of gods who were now considered demons or delusions. After the hieroglyphs became decorative mysteries rather than readable texts, fascinating but incomprehensible, ancient but inaccessible, objects of wonder and speculation but not of understanding, we find the silence that lasted 14 centuries until Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone in 1822 and the hieroglyphs could speak again, could be read by modern scholars who had learned the key, who had understood that the script was both phonetic and ideographic, who had cracked the code that had seemed unbreakable, who had made the ancient Egyptian voices audible across the gulf that had seemed unbridgeable, who had restored the hieroglyphs from sacred silence to speaking presence, from mystery to knowledge, from incomprehensible decoration to readable text. The Rosetta Stone with its 3 scripts, hieroglyphic and demotic in Greek, all saying the same thing, all providing the key that Champollion needed to unlock the hieroglyphs, was fragment of larger stele erected in 196 BCE during the Ptolemaic period, was trilingual decree that allowed comparison of known language Greek with unknown languages hieroglyphic and demotic, was accidental survival that made decipherment possible, was the bridge across 14 centuries of silence, was the tool that restored Egyptian voices to human hearing, that made the temple inscriptions readable and the tomb texts translatable and the papyrus documents accessible, that opened the entire world of ancient Egyptian thought and belief and daily life to modern understanding, that transformed Egyptology from speculation based on classical sources and biblical references into science based on reading what the Egyptians themselves had written. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the hieroglyphs speak now in museums and in scholarly publications, speak through the thousands of texts that have been translated since Champollion's breakthrough, speak about gods and kings, speak about rituals and offerings, speak about journeys through the underworld and transformations into divine forms, speak about everything that mattered to the Egyptians who carved and painted and wrote them, who trusted that the signs would preserve not just information but power, would create realities through inscription, would make permanent what was temporary, would give voice to silence, would allow the dead to speak, would ensure that prayers would be heard eternally, would protect tombs with written spells, would guide souls with written instructions, would make the hieroglyphs not just writing but magic, not just communication but creation, not just signs but living powers that would continue to act as long as they remained visible, as long as they could be read, as long as they existed on the walls and in the tombs and on the papyrus. The hieroglyphs that spoke in sacred silence spoke through their beauty and through their meaning, through their visual impact and through their semantic content, through being simultaneously art and text, image and sound, decoration and communication, through operating on multiple levels at once: the aesthetic level where they pleased the eye with their careful proportions and their elegant forms, the phonetic level where they recorded the sounds of the ancient Egyptian language, the ideographic level where they represented concepts directly without passing through sound, the magical level where they possessed power independent of their communicative function, where they were active agents rather than passive records, where they created rather than merely described, where they were the hieroglyphs that spoke in sacred silence, that speak still from temple walls and tomb chambers, from papyrus scrolls and obelisk surfaces, from every place where ancient Egyptians inscribed them. From the sacred silence where they wait to be read, where they preserve Egyptian thought across 3,000 years of history, where they testify to the civilization that created them, that used them, that made them sacred, that made them speak, that made them the hieroglyphs, the sacred carvings, the divine script, the writing that was gift from Thoth, the signs that were magic, the language that was power, the hieroglyphs that spoke in sacred silence and that speak still to those who have learned to read them. Who have cracked the code, who have entered the silence, who have heard the voices, who have understood that the hieroglyphs are not just ancient writing system but are window into ancient mind, into worldview where writing was sacred act, where words possessed power, where to inscribe was to create, where the hieroglyph spoke in sacred silence that was not really silence but was speaking of different kind, speaking that endured across millennia, speaking that continues as long as the inscriptions survive. As long as scholars can read them, as long as the temple walls stand and the tomb chambers preserve their paintings and the papyrus scrolls are protected in museums, as long as the hieroglyphs that spoke in sacred silence continue to speak, continue to testify, continue to preserve the Egyptian voices that tell us about gods and kings and beliefs and daily life, that tell us about the civilization of the Nile, that speak through the sacred script. Through the hieroglyphs that were silence and speech simultaneously, that were visible and invisible simultaneously, that were human creation and divine gift simultaneously, that were the hieroglyphs that spoke in sacred silence. The pharaoh was not merely ruler but was living God, was Horus incarnate dwelling in human form, was the one who maintained Ma'at, the cosmic order, the balance, the proper functioning of the universe through his existence and through his actions, was simultaneously mortal man who would die and be succeeded and divine being whose essence was eternal, and whose kingship participated in cosmic order that had existed since creation, and that would continue until the end of time. Was the bridge between divine realm where the gods dwelt and human realm where mortals struggled and suffered and died, was the mediator who made offerings to the gods on behalf of all Egyptians and who received offerings from Egyptians on behalf of the gods, was the pivot around which everything turned, the axis of Egyptian cosmos. The essential link without whom the sun might not rise and the Nile might not flood and the seasons might not cycle properly, and chaos might overwhelm order and isfit the forces of disorder and destruction personified by the serpent Apophis, who attacked Ra's solar bark each night might triumph over Ma'at. The pharaoh's duties were not political in the modern sense, but were ritual. He maintained the temples and performed the ceremonies that sustained the cosmos, that ensured the sun would rise through his daily rituals that identified him with Ra, that ensured the Nile would flood through his relationship with Hapi, that kept the seasons cycling through his participation in agricultural festivals, that prevented chaos from overwhelming order through proper performance of rituals that had been performed by every legitimate king since the first pharaoh, since Narmer or Menes, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE and established the pattern that all pharaohs would follow, the pattern of divine kingship that made Egypt unique among ancient civilizations. That created system where religious authority and political authority and military authority were not separate but were dimensions of single office, where the pharaoh was simultaneously high priest and supreme commander and absolute monarch, where all power flowed from and through the god-king. It is said that the pharaoh underwent transformation at coronation, that the rituals performed when he assumed the double crown, the white crown of Upper Egypt combined with the red crown of Lower Egypt, changed him from prince into god-king, activated the divine essence that had been potential and made it actual, made him into Horus, the living king who would upon death become Osiris, the king of the underworld, who would rule in the afterlife as he had ruled in life, who would continue to be pharaoh even after his mummy was sealed in its tomb and his successor took the throne, because pharaonic office was eternal even though individual pharaohs were mortal, because the kingship passed from father to son or from brother to brother, but the essential divine nature remained constant, because each pharaoh was both himself individual with personal name and personal ka and was also the office, the eternal pharaoh, the perpetual Horus, the unchanging divine presence that manifested through successive mortal bodies. Beneath the silence of the coronation ceremonies and the daily temple rituals and the festivals that renewed Pharaoh's power after 30 years of rule, and that involved ritualized running and performing of various acts that demonstrated the king's continued vigor and his fitness to rule, and the complex theology that explained how mortal king could be divine, could be both Horus during life and Osiris after death, could rule in this world and in the next world, could be one pharaoh and all pharaohs simultaneously, could embody the office that was eternal even though the individual officeholder was temporary. We can sense the sophistication of Egyptian political theology, the way it solved problem of mortality by making kingship immortal even when kings died, by ensuring continuity through divine essence that passed from pharaoh to pharaoh like torch passed from runner to runner, by creating system that was remarkably stable across 3,000 years despite periods of disruption and foreign conquest, that maintained its essential character through Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom and Late Period, through dynasties that rose and fell, through pharaohs who were strong and weak, native Egyptian and foreign, male and occasionally female, through all the changes that 3 millennia brought to Egypt. The pharaoh's regalia symbolized his dual nature and his cosmic role, the double crown representing his rule over Upper and Lower Egypt, the crook and flail representing his role as shepherd of his people and as agricultural provider, the false beard representing his connection to the gods who were depicted with beards even though Egyptian men typically went clean-shaven, the uraeus, the cobra that appeared on the crown and that represented the Eye of Ra, representing the pharaoh's protective power and his ability to destroy enemies through divine fire, the various crowns and headdresses that were worn for different ceremonies and that connected the pharaoh to different gods and different aspects of royal power, the entire apparatus of kingship that was visible and symbolic and powerful, that proclaimed through its very presence that this was not ordinary man but was God walking on earth. Where memory fades into the recognition that we can never fully reconstruct what it meant to be pharaoh, to hold position that was both exalted and burdensome, that required constant ritual performance and that allowed extraordinary power, that made the pharaoh both servant of the gods and master of humans, that placed him at the apex of society, but also made him responsible for everything that went wrong. Natural disasters and military defeats and economic problems were Pharaoh's failures, were signs that he was not properly maintaining Ma'at, that he was not adequately fulfilling his divine duties, that his kingship was flawed and that the gods were displeased. We find that the god-kings who walked between worlds walked a path that was lonely and demanding, that required them to be more than human while remaining human, to be divine while being mortal, to rule while serving, to command while obeying the gods, to be simultaneously person and office, individual and institution, man and God. Temporary and eternal, the pharaoh who would die and the pharaoh who would live forever. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the pharaohs speak through the monuments they built, through the temples they dedicated, through the inscriptions that record their names and their titles, the fivefold titulary that identified each pharaoh as Horus. As lord of the two ladies, the vulture goddess Nekhebit of Upper Egypt and the cobra goddess Wajet of Lower Egypt, as golden Horus, as king of Upper and Lower Egypt, and by his personal name through the statues that show them in the conventional poses that proclaimed their divinity. Through the reliefs that depict them performing rituals and smiting enemies and receiving blessings from gods, through everything that preserves their presence and their power, through the god-kings who walked between worlds during their lifetimes and who walk between worlds still, through the monuments that preserve their memory, through the names that have survived even though the individuals who bore those names have been dust for millennia, through the eternal pharaoh that each pharaoh became when he died. Through the transformation from Horus to Osiris that death brought, through the continuation of kingship even when individual kings ended, through the divine office that transcended mortality, through the god-kings who walked between worlds and who walk there still in memory and in monument, and in the recognition that they were not merely ancient rulers but were embodiments of theological system that made kingship sacred, that made Pharaoh into God, that made Egypt into the land where god-kings walked between worlds. Where they maintained Ma'at, where they sustained the cosmos, where they were Pharaoh's living gods who ruled the Black Land, who wore the double crown, who carried the crook and flail, who were Horus and would become Osiris, who walked between the world of gods and the world of humans, who were the bridge, the mediator, the pivot, the axis, the essential link, the god-kings who walked between worlds. In the Valley of the Kings, where the cliffs rise like natural walls creating hidden landscape accessible only through narrow wadi that could be guarded and controlled, where the pyramid-shaped peak of El Qun, the Horn, dominates the skyline and perhaps suggested this location as sacred, as the place where the primordial mound was reflected in natural rather than constructed form. Where for 500 years during the New Kingdom, from approximately 1500 to 1000 BCE, pharaohs chose to be buried not in pyramids that announced their presence to any thief who might come seeking treasure, but in tombs cut deep into the rock that hid their burials from looters. That created necropolis that was simultaneously public. The funerals were grand ceremonies witnessed by thousands, and secret, the actual location of the burial chamber at the end of descending corridors carved into solid rock, was meant to remain hidden forever. The decorated corridors descend into the earth following the path that the sun takes through the night sky, following the journey described in the Amjuat and other underworld books. Following the 12 hours of darkness through which the deceased must travel to reach resurrection. The tombs are books as much as they are burial places. Their walls are covered with texts and images from the funerary literature that guides the deceased through the dangers of the underworld. That tells him what spells to recite and what transformations to undergo. That shows him the demons he will encounter and the gods who will judge him. That depicts the hall of Ma'at, where his heart will be weighed against the feather of truth, and where Ammit the devourer waits to consume those who fail the test, whose hearts are heavy with sin and who therefore cannot proceed to the afterlife but must suffer the second death, the true death, the death that is annihilation rather than transformation, the death that the Egyptians feared more than physical death because it meant the end of existence, the cessation of consciousness, the failure of all the elaborate preparations and expensive rituals and careful mummification that were meant to ensure eternal life. It is said that the valley was chosen for its isolation and for its natural pyramid peak, for its distance from the Nile and from the areas where people lived and worked, for its location on the western bank of the river where the sun set and where the realm of the dead was believed to exist, for its aridity that would help preserve the mummies, for its sacred geography that made it appropriate site for royal burials, for all these reasons and perhaps for others that we do not understand, that are lost. That made sense within Egyptian theological framework, but that are opaque to us who do not share that framework, who must reconstruct it from texts and reliefs and the evidence of the tombs themselves, who must interpret the symbols and the spells and the elaborate iconography that covers every surface of the burial chambers, that transforms the tomb into cosmos in miniature, into map of the afterlife, into guide for the journey that every deceased person must make. Beneath the silence of the tomb chambers where the pharaohs lay in massive stone sarcophagi carved from single blocks of granite or alabaster or quartzite, where the walls were painted with scenes from the underworld books showing the king's journey and transformation, where the coffins nested one inside another, sometimes 4 or 5 coffins, each more elaborate than the last, each covered with protective spells and images of gods, each contributing to the protection of the mummy that lay at the center like sacred kernel, protected by multiple layers of magical armor, where the burial goods included everything needed for the afterlife. Food and drink stored in jars, furniture including beds and chairs and chests, jewelry and amulets, shabti figures by the hundreds who would serve the king in the afterlife when the gods required labor, who would answer the call in the king's place and do the work so that the deceased could enjoy eternity without toil. We can imagine what these tombs contained before the ancient thieves found them, before the robberies that occurred sometimes within decades of the burial and sometimes within years or even months. Before almost every royal burial in the valley was violated and looted, before the treasures were stolen, and the mummies were damaged or destroyed in frantic searches for precious metals and stones that were believed to be hidden within the wrappings. Where memory fades into the recognition that only one royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings survived relatively intact, the tomb of Tutankhamun discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, small tomb filled with treasures that demonstrate what was lost from all the larger and more elaborate tombs of more important pharaohs. Tomb of relatively minor king who died young and whose burial was probably rushed, and whose tomb was small compared to those of Seti I or Ramesses II or other great pharaohs, but whose treasures survived because his tomb was accidentally buried beneath rubble from later tomb construction, and was thereby hidden from looters who found and emptied almost every other tomb in the valley. We find that the valley where shadows were meant to sleep forever became instead valley where shadows were awakened. Where tombs were opened, where mummies were disturbed, where the eternal rest was interrupted, where the promises made to the deceased were broken not by the gods but by humans who valued gold more than sanctity, who violated sacred spaces for profit, who destroyed what had been carefully preserved, who scattered what had been lovingly arranged, who made the valley of eternal sleep into valley of eternal disturbance. The modern opening of the tombs for archaeological study and for tourism continues the disturbance in different way, not theft but examination, not looting but documentation, not violation driven by greed but violation driven by curiosity and by desire for knowledge, but violation nonetheless from the perspective of those who buried the dead, who sealed the tombs, who trusted that the pharaohs would rest undisturbed until the moment of resurrection, who never imagined that thousands of tourists would walk daily through the corridors that were meant to be traversed only by the deceased and by the priests who performed the burial rituals, who never conceived that the mummies would be removed and X-rayed and DNA tested and displayed in museums, who never thought that the sacred silence would be broken by camera flashes and tour guides' explanations, and the breathing of visitors that introduces humidity and carbon dioxide that damage the ancient paintings. That makes the colors fade, that threatens the very preservation that the dry climate had maintained for 3,000 years. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the Valley of the Kings speaks through its tombs, through the corridors that descend into rock, through the chambers decorated with underworld scenes, through the sarcophagi that stand empty now, through the mummies that lie in museums, through the treasures that are displayed far from the tombs where they were meant to remain forever, through the recognition that the valley where shadows sleep forever holds shadows that no longer sleep, that have been awakened and disturbed and studied and photographed and made into tourist attractions. That exist now not in eternal rest but in eternal visibility, not in sacred darkness but in artificial light, not in sealed silence but in the noise of tourism and scholarship, not sleeping but watchful, not resting but waiting, not in the afterlife they expected but in the present they never imagined, in the valley where shadows sleep forever but sleep no longer, where they wait instead, where they remember, where they speak through the monuments that preserve them, through the tombs that tourists visit. Through the texts that scholars translate, through the evidence that archaeology recovers, through the valley that was meant to be hidden but that has been revealed, that was meant to be silent but that has been made to speak, that was meant to hold shadows in eternal sleep but that holds them now in eternal wakefulness, in the valley where shadows sleep no more, where the Valley of the Kings has become valley of interrupted rest, valley of awakened shadows, valley where eternal sleep became historical curiosity. Where sacred became archaeological, where the pharaohs who were meant to sleep forever wait instead in museums and in tombs open to visitors, wait in the valley where shadows sleep forever, where shadows sleep no longer, where the valley speaks. At Giza, where the limestone guardian crouches facing east toward the rising sun with patient gaze that has watched the horizon for 4.5 millennia, where the body of a lion merges with the head that may represent Khafre, or may represent an earlier ruler, or may represent the sun god Ra-Horakhti himself. Where the monumental sculpture carved from a single outcrop of bedrock with additional limestone blocks added to extend the pause gazes across the desert with eyes that have seen every sunrise and every empire that rose and fell in Egypt, that have seen Persian conquerors and Greek conquerors and Roman conquerors and Arab conquerors and Ottoman rulers and British colonizers and modern Egyptian nation-states, that have seen everything and revealed nothing, that hold secrets as patiently as the stone from which the monument was carved. The Sphinx embodies mystery that archaeology cannot solve with certainty, that excavation cannot answer definitively, that scholarship continues to debate with passion and without resolution who built it and when and why and what it means, what it guards or represents or proclaims, whether it is merely guardian of the pyramids that rise behind it, or whether it is itself the monument that the pyramids protect. Whether its secrets are architectural or theological or astronomical or some combination that we cannot fully grasp because we do not think as the ancient Egyptians thought, do not see the world through their cosmological framework, do not understand the associations and meanings that would have been obvious to them, but that are opaque to us across the vast temporal and cultural distance. The traditional dating places the Sphinx's construction during the reign of Khafre in the 4th dynasty around 2500 BCE, contemporary with Khafre's pyramid that stands behind it, carved from the limestone that was already there when the pyramid builders arrived. shaped from the bedrock with additional blocks quarried nearby to create the leonine body that measures 240 feet long and 66 feet high. That represents fusion of human intelligence with leonine power. That creates image of Pharaoh as simultaneously wise and strong, divine and royal, protector and ruler, guardian of the sacred necropolis and symbol of the sun god who traverses the sky daily and who rises in the east where the Sphinx faces with eternal vigilance. It is said that the dream stele erected between the Sphinx's massive paws in the 18th dynasty, more than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was supposedly carved, records how Thutmose IV stopped to rest in the monument's shadow when he was still prince, how he fell asleep and dreamed, how the Sphinx spoke to him promising that he would become pharaoh if he would clear away the sand that had accumulated and that threatened to bury the monument completely, leaving only the head visible above the desert surface. How Thutmose honored this promise after becoming king and how he erected the stele between the paws as testament to divine intervention in royal succession, as evidence that the Sphinx possessed consciousness and will and could speak to those chosen by the gods, that the monument was not merely stone carved into shape but was living presence that could influence human events, that was guardian not just of the pyramids but of pharaonic legitimacy, of royal succession, of the proper order that required divine approval. Beneath the silence of debates about the Sphinx's age and purpose, debates that have intensified in recent decades with alternative theorists proposing that the monument is much older than conventional Egyptology acknowledges, that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx's body suggest water erosion rather than wind erosion. That water erosion would require rainfall that did not occur in Egypt during the historical period, but that did occur during the wetter climate of the early Holocene period before 7000 BCE, that therefore the Sphinx must predate Egyptian civilization as we understand it, must have been carved by earlier culture that possessed capabilities that we have not properly acknowledged, that the head may have been recarved during the 4th dynasty from earlier form, that the proportions of the head relative to the body suggest recarving, that the entire conventional chronology may need to be reconsidered. We can sense how the Sphinx frustrates our desire for certainty, how it resists easy answers, how it remains enigmatic despite intense study that has included measuring and photographing and analyzing the weathering patterns and the tool marks and the geological formation and every aspect of the monument's construction and condition. The weathering that has given the Sphinx its distinctive appearance, the body deeply eroded with channels and hollows that create textured surface quite different from the smoother head, the missing nose that was deliberately chiseled off at some point. Traditional stories blaming Napoleon's troops are false. The damage predates Napoleon's expedition and may have been inflicted by Muslim iconoclasts or may simply be result of erosion and weathering. The missing beard that once extended from the chin and fragments of which are preserved in museums testifies to the monument's great age and to the forces that have attacked it across millennia. Wind carrying abrasive sand, humidity causing salt crystallization within the porous limestone, human vandalism both ancient and modern, the simple passage of time that erodes all things eventually, that reduces even monumental sculptures to rubble, that will eventually destroy the Sphinx as it destroys everything, though the destruction proceeds slowly enough that the monument has survived 4.5 millennia and may survive several more if properly conserved. Where memory fades into the recognition that we project our own mysteries onto the Sphinx, that we make it into symbol of ancient wisdom that we imagine the Egyptians possessed, that we use it as screen onto which we project our romantic notions about lost knowledge and hidden truths and civilizations that were more advanced than conventional scholarship acknowledges. That the Sphinx has become in modern imagination repository for every theory about ancient mysteries and unexplained phenomena, and the possibility that human history is older and stranger than we believe. That it serves as icon for alternative archaeology and for all the speculation about advanced prehistoric civilizations and about knowledge that was supposedly possessed and lost, and that might be encoded in monuments like the Sphinx. We find that the guardian guards not just the pyramids and not just the necropolis, but guards our relationship with the past, guards the boundary between what we know and what we imagine, guards the question without answer that it embodies and that perhaps is its true purpose, the mystery that is more important than any solution, the uncertainty that is more valuable than any certainty, the question that remains question, that refuses to become answer, that continues to fascinate precisely because it continues to resist resolution. The Sphinx has been excavated and reburied and excavated again multiple times. The sand accumulates around it whenever excavation stops, whenever conservation efforts pause, whenever the desert reclaims what humans have temporarily cleared, creating cycle of revelation and concealment that mirrors the monument's essential nature as simultaneously visible and hidden, known and unknown, obvious and mysterious. The largest and most recognizable sculpture from ancient Egypt, and also the least understood, the most photographed and the most enigmatic, the guardian that everyone sees and that no one fully comprehends, that poses riddle not through words but through its mere existence, through the questions it raises by standing where it stands, facing where it faces, combining what it combines, guarding what it guards. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the Sphinx speaks through its silence, through its patient gaze toward the sunrise, through its leonine body and human head, through the questions it poses without ever speaking, through the mystery it embodies without ever explaining, through its survival across 4.5 millennia during which empires rose and fell and languages died and religions replaced other religions and the entire human world transformed multiple times while the Sphinx remained essentially unchanged, facing east, guarding, watching, waiting. Silent, enigmatic, the monument that is simultaneously transparent, it is right there, visible to anyone who visits Giza, photographed millions of times, studied intensively and opaque. We do not know with certainty who built it or when or why or what it meant to those who carved it. We do not understand its purpose beyond speculation. We cannot read its meaning with confidence. The Sphinx that guards the question without answer. That is the question without answer. That transforms every proposed answer into another question. That demonstrates through its very existence that some mysteries remain mysterious not because we lack sufficient evidence, but because the mystery itself is the point, because the questioning is what matters, because the Sphinx guards not secret knowledge but guards the recognition that some things remain unknown, that uncertainty is valid state, that not everything can be explained and measured and definitively solved. That the question without answer has its own value, its own power, its own purpose. The Sphinx at Giza crouches still, facing the sunrise, guarding the pyramids or guarding something else or guarding nothing except the mystery, watching with stone eyes that have seen everything and that reveal nothing, that hold the secret or that hold no secret except the secret that there is no secret, that the mystery is the mystery of existence itself, that the question without answer is the question that the Sphinx poses simply by being what it is: monumental sculpture that combines human and animal. That faces the sunrise with eternal patience, that has survived while civilizations rose and fell around it. That guards the necropolis and guards the mystery and guards the question. That is the Sphinx, the enigma, the guardian, the mystery that archaeology studies and that imagination elaborates, that conventional Egyptology dates to Kafir and that alternative theories date to prehistoric times, that everyone sees and that no one fully understands, that speaks through silence, that answers through questioning. That guards through watching, that is the Sphinx that guards a question without answer, that guards it still, that will guard it as long as the stone endures, as long as the monument stands at Giza facing the sunrise, as long as the leonine body supports the human head, as long as the eyes gaze across the desert, as long as the Sphinx remains the Sphinx, the guardian, the mystery, the question without answer. At Karnak, where columns rise like petrified forest reaching toward the sky in the great hypostyle hall that contains 134 massive pillars creating space that is simultaneously enclosed and vast, simultaneously human scale in its individual elements and superhuman in its totality, simultaneously architectural achievement and theological statement. Where the columns reach heights of 6 to 9 feet and diameters of 12 feet, and are topped with capitals carved to represent papyrus bundles and lotus blossoms, creating architectural garden of stone that never withers, that blooms eternally in sandstone and in granite, where light once filtered through clerestory windows in shafts that made the columns glow, and made the painted decorations visible in ways that created atmosphere of sacred mystery, of divine presence. Of threshold space between earth and heaven, where the boundaries were thin and where gods could descend, and humans could ascend without fully crossing the barrier that separated mortal from divine realm. The temples proclaimed through their architecture and through their decoration and through their sheer scale that the gods dwelt here, that this was not merely building but was actual house of deity, that Amun-Ra resided in the sanctuary at the temple's heart where only the pharaoh and the highest priests could enter. Where the cult statue was kept in darkness except during the daily rituals, where offerings were made and hymns were sung, and the relationship between divine and human realms was maintained through performance of ceremonies that had been performed daily for centuries. The temples grew across time through accretion, each pharaoh adding to the complex that his predecessors had begun, each generation expanding and elaborating and building onto what already existed, creating palimpsest of architectural styles and theological emphases where different periods layered one upon another, where the processional way from the entrance pylons to the inner sanctuary passed through courts and halls added by different rulers. Where reading the temple was like reading the history of Egypt itself, where Thutmose I and Hatshepsut and Thutmose III and Amenhotep III and Ramesses II and countless other pharaohs left their marks, built their additions, inscribed their names in hieroglyphs carved into every surface, claimed the temple as their own even while acknowledging that they were merely latest in long line of builders who had served Amun-Ra, who had maintained his house, who had ensured that the god was properly honored and properly housed and properly served. It is said that the temple at Karnak was connected to Luxor Temple 2 miles to the south by the Avenue of Sphinxes, a processional way lined with hundreds of Sphinx statues that created sacred corridor through which the statue of Amun would be carried during the Apit festival. Annual celebration that lasted for weeks, and that involved carrying the god's image from Karnak to Luxor in sacred bark ceremonial boat carried on the shoulders of priests while crowds watched and celebrated, and while the air filled with incense smoke and the sound of sistrums shaking and hymns being sung and the entire city participating in the ritual that renewed the pharaoh's ka, that reinforced the divine kingship, that celebrated the relationship between Amun and the king. That made visible and public the theological system that sustained Egyptian civilization, that demonstrated through ritual and procession and architecture that the gods were present, that they dwelt in the temples, that they could be honored and served, and that they would bless Egypt in return for proper service. Beneath the silence of the temples now, where tourists wander through spaces that were once restricted to priests and pharaohs, where the god no longer dwells in the sanctuary and the daily rituals are no longer performed and the offerings are no longer made and the hymns are no longer sung, where the paint has faded from the columns revealing the bare stone underneath, where the ceilings have collapsed in places exposing the halls to open sky, where the sacred lake where priests performed purification rituals before entering the temple is empty or stagnant, where the entire complex is archaeological site and tourist attraction rather than functioning religious center, rather than living temple where the god was served and where the cosmos was maintained through daily ritual, we can sense the loss that occurred when the temples were closed, when the old religion was suppressed and replaced first by Christianity and then by Islam. When the last priests who knew the rituals and who could read the hieroglyphic texts died without successors, when the knowledge of how to serve the gods was lost, when the temples fell silent and the gods departed or were believed to have departed or simply ceased to receive the service that Egyptian theology insisted they required, that they had received daily for 3,000 years, that had sustained the relationship between divine and human realms. Where memory fades into the experience of worshipping in these temples when they were active, when the rituals were performed daily, when priests in white linen robes entered the sanctuary before dawn to awaken the god, to open the shrine, to present offerings of food and drink and incense, to chant the hymns that praised Amun-Ra, to perform the elaborate sequence of ritual actions that maintained cosmic order, when the temple was not museum but was functioning sacred space. When approaching the sanctuary meant approaching the divine presence, when the columns and the shadows and the incense smoke and the sounds of worship created atmosphere that modern visitors cannot experience even when they try to imagine it, cannot reconstruct even when they study the texts that describe the rituals, cannot fully understand because the lived experience of Egyptian religion is lost, is separated from us not just by time but by the unbridgeable gap between believing and studying belief. Between worship and analysis, we find that the temples preserve the architecture but not the faith, preserve the spaces but not the experiences, preserve the stones but not the spirits, preserve everything except what mattered most to those who built them and who served in them and who worshipped there. The temples that touched the edge of heaven touched it through their height and through their function, through reaching upward architecturally and through bridging the gap between divine and human ritually, through being simultaneously physical structures that can be measured and photographed, and through being sacred spaces that cannot be fully comprehended by those who do not share the worldview that created them. Through being buildings made of stone that will endure for millennia, and through being houses of gods who departed when the worship ceased, through being monuments that testify to Egyptian architectural genius and engineering capability, and through being mysteries that we can study but cannot fully solve, that we can analyze but cannot fully understand, that we can admire but cannot fully appreciate because we lack the theological framework within which they made complete sense. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the temples speak through their columns that still rise toward the sky even when the roofs they supported have collapsed. Speak through the hieroglyphs that cover every surface, recording the names of gods and pharaohs and the rituals that were performed and the offerings that were made. Speak through the sanctuaries that stand empty now but that once held the cult statues. Speak through the sacred lakes that are dry now but that once provided the water for purification rituals. Speak through the processional ways where the gods were carried during festivals. Speak through everything that preserves the architecture and the decoration even when the function has been lost. Even when the purpose has been transformed from religious to touristic, even when the temples that touch the edge of heaven touch only memory now, touch only the present through their survival as monuments, touch us through their scale and their beauty and their mystery, touch eternity through their endurance across 3 millennia. Through their survival despite the suppression of the religion that created them, through their testimony to what ancient Egypt valued, to the enormous resources that were devoted to building houses for gods, to the conviction that the temples were essential infrastructure for maintaining cosmic order, for ensuring that the sun would rise and the Nile would flood and the seasons would cycle, for keeping chaos at bay through proper service to the divine powers that controlled the universe. The temples at Karnak and Luxor and throughout Egypt at Edfu and Dendera and Falah and Abu Simbel, and countless other sites where temples stand or stood or lie in ruins testify to Egyptian devotion and Egyptian architectural achievement. Testify to the civilization that touched the edge of heaven through building monuments that reached toward the divine, through creating sacred spaces where heaven and earth met, through constructing the architecture that would allow the gods to dwell among humans. Through making stone into threshold, through making columns into the supports that held up the sky, through making temples into the places where the edge of heaven touched the earth, where the divine touched the human, where the cosmos was maintained, where Amun-Ra was served, where the temples touched the edge of heaven and made heaven accessible, made heaven present, made heaven real through the stone and the rituals and the faith that animated both. Through the temples that touched the edge of heaven when heaven was believed and that touch memory now that heaven has become metaphor, that touch history now that the religion has been replaced, that touch eternity now through their survival, through their stones that remain when the faith has departed, through the temples that touched the edge of heaven. In the cool, dry darkness of tombs cut into rock or built in the desert where the absence of moisture preserves what moisture would destroy, where the air is still and ancient and filled with the dust of millennia, where the silence is broken only by the footsteps of archaeologists or tourists or by the sounds of sand shifting and settling, the mummified dead weight wrapped in linen bandages that were applied with prayers and spells. Surrounded by amulets placed at specific locations on the body according to instructions in funerary texts that specified exactly how mummification should be performed, how the deceased should be prepared for the journey through the underworld, and for the resurrection that Egyptian theology promised to those who were properly preserved and properly buried, and who passed the judgment in the hall of Ma'at, whose hearts were found to be lighter than the feather of truth, who were declared justified and who were permitted to proceed to the afterlife, to the field of reeds where they would live eternally in paradise that was idealized version of Egypt, where the harvests were always abundant and where labor was not required because the Shabti figures would do the work, where existence would be perfect and eternal and unchanged. The mummification process required 70 days from death to burial, required specialized priests who knew the rituals and the techniques, required expensive materials including natron salt from the Wadi Natron for drying the body, linen from the flax fields for wrapping, resins and oils imported from distant lands for anointing, amulets of gold and precious stones for protecting. Canopic jars for preserving the internal organs that were removed from the body, the lungs and liver and stomach and intestines, while the heart was left in place because it was believed to be the seat of consciousness and intelligence. The organ that would be weighed in the judgment, the part of the person that contained the ka and that therefore must remain with the body, must be preserved as carefully as the body itself was preserved. Must be protected with special heart scarab amulet inscribed with spell from the Book of the Dead that would prevent the heart from testifying against the deceased, that would ensure the heart would speak favorably or would remain silent when Anubis placed it on the scales against the feather of Maat. It is said that mummification was expensive enough that only the wealthy could afford the complete process, that poorer Egyptians had to content themselves with simpler preservation that might involve wrapping the body in linen after minimal treatment with natron, that the poorest were buried in the sand without elaborate preparation and were preserved through natural desiccation when the conditions were right, that Egyptian society was stratified even in death. That the quality of mummification and the elaborateness of burial and the richness of grave goods all reflected social status, all proclaimed in death the hierarchies that had structured life, all ensured that even in the afterlife the distinctions would continue, that the noble would enter paradise with greater resources than the commoner, that eternity itself was unequal, was structured by the same principles that organized temporal existence. Beneath the silence of the mummies that lie in museums now, displayed behind glass where visitors pass by looking at the wrapped forms, or at the unwrapped remains that show desiccated features and empty eye sockets and skin that has darkened and tightened across the bones, reading the labels that identify who they were when they were alive, pharaohs and queens and nobles and priests, what dynasty they lived in, what their titles and accomplishments were. Reduced to objects of curiosity and scientific study, and sometimes to macabre fascination with death made visible, with bodies that have not decayed normally but have been preserved in ways that make them uncanny, that make them simultaneously human and not human, familiar and alien, recognizable as former persons and obviously no longer persons, dead for millennia but not gone, present but not alive. Existing in state that was meant to be temporary, the preserved body awaiting resurrection, but that has become permanent. The waiting that has become eternal, we can contemplate what has been lost when the mummies were removed from their tombs, when they were unwrapped by enthusiastic archaeologists in the 19th century who sometimes held unwrapping parties attended by European tourists. When they were subjected to scientific analysis that would have seemed like violation to those who mummified them and those who buried them with such care and such faith in resurrection. When the preservation that was meant to ensure eternal life became instead mechanism for creating museum specimens, for generating archaeological data, for satisfying modern curiosity about ancient funerary practices. Where memory fades into the ethics of disturbing the dead, of removing mummies from their burial contexts and displaying them in museums far from Egypt, in London and Paris and New York and Berlin, and countless other cities where Egyptian mummies draw crowds and generate revenue and satisfy public fascination, with ancient Egypt of subjecting them to CT scans and DNA analysis and facial reconstruction, and all the techniques that modern science has developed for extracting information from ancient remains. of the tension between respecting ancient beliefs and pursuing knowledge about ancient cultures, between preserving mummies as archaeological evidence and treating them as human remains that deserve burial and rest, between the scientific value of studying mummies and the moral questions about whether we have the right to disturb the dead even when they have been dead for thousands of years, even when they belong to civilization that no longer exists. Even when no one worships the gods they worshipped or believes the theology that motivated their mummification, we find ourselves in ambiguous territory where there are no easy answers, where reverence and curiosity conflict, where the desire to preserve and study and learn confronts the recognition that the dead were mummified because they believed they would need their bodies, that they trusted in resurrection, that they expected to live again. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the mummies speak through their silence, speak through their preservation across millennia, speak through the fact that we can look at faces of people who lived 3,000 years ago, can see Ramesses II and Seti I and Hatshepsut and others whose names echo through history, can confront mortality made tangible, can see what happens to human body when it is preserved rather than buried and allowed to decay naturally. It can study the evidence of diseases and injuries and lifespans and diets and everything else that paleopathology can extract from mummified remains, can learn from the dead even as we acknowledge the ethical complexity of disturbing their rest, of violating the promises made to them at burial, of opening the tombs that were meant to remain sealed, of unwrapping the mummies that were meant to remain wrapped until the moment of resurrection, of making the mummies into objects of study when they were meant to be subjects of eternal life. The mummies that wait in golden darkness wait now in museum display cases under artificial lights, wait in storage facilities where they are preserved under climate-controlled conditions, wait in tombs that have been opened and resealed and opened again by archaeologists and conservators, wait in the state that was meant to be temporary but that has become permanent, wait for the resurrection that their theology promised but that has not come. Wait in the darkness that is not golden anymore but is fluorescent or LED. Wait in the silence that is not silence anymore but is broken by tourists and scholars. Wait as they have waited for 3 millennia. Wait as they will wait as long as they are preserved. Wait as mummies wait, preserved but not alive, protected but not sleeping, existing but not living. The mummies that wait in golden darkness, that wait in the museums and the tombs, that wait in the dust and the dry air. That wait in the state between death and resurrection, that wait for the moment that may never come, that wait in the golden darkness that has become archaeological light, that wait as testimony to Egyptian beliefs about death and afterlife, that wait as evidence of Egyptian mummification practices, that wait as human remains that were once living persons who died believing they would live again, who were mummified because they trusted in resurrection, who wait still in the darkness. In the golden darkness of memory and museum, in the darkness where the mummies wait. Rising from temple courtyards and from public squares in Rome and Paris and New York and London and Istanbul, and dozens of other cities far from Egypt where they were quarried in the granite hills of Aswan, and carved into monolithic needles of stone reaching toward heaven, transported hundreds of miles down the Nile on specially built barges that required extraordinary engineering to float stones weighing hundreds of tons. Erected using techniques that remain partially mysterious despite scholarly attempts to reconstruct the process using evidence from reliefs and from tool marks, and from the unfinished obelisk that still lies in the Aswan quarry partially cut from the bedrock, but abandoned when a crack appeared that would have made it unstable. The obelisks stand as monuments that were sacred to Ra, the sun god. As representations of the Benben stone on which the sun god first stood at creation when the primordial mound emerged from the waters of chaos, as frozen rays of sunlight made tangible in granite, as petrified beams extending from earth to heaven, creating connection between the mortal realm where pharaohs ruled and the celestial realm where Ra sailed in his bark. As symbols of solar power and royal power intertwined, because the pharaoh was son of Ra and representative of Ra and living embodiment of Ra's authority on earth. The obelisks were typically erected in pairs flanking the entrances to temples, creating solar gateway through which the faithful would pass, creating architectural representation of the horizon where the sun rises between two mountains, creating sacred threshold that marked the boundary between the ordinary world outside and the divine realm within, creating the liminal space where heaven and earth met, where the sun's power was concentrated. Where the pharaoh's name inscribed on all four sides of the obelisk would be illuminated by the rising sun and by the setting sun, would catch the first light of dawn and the last light of dusk, would be eternally associated with the solar cycle, with the daily resurrection of Ra, who died each evening when he descended into the underworld, and who was reborn each morning when he emerged victorious over Apophis, the chaos serpent who attempted each night to prevent the sunrise, who represented the forces of disorder that constantly threatened to overwhelm Ma'at, that could be held at bay only through proper ritual and proper observance and proper maintenance of the relationship between divine and human realms. It is said that creating an obelisk required extraordinary engineering and extraordinary labor and extraordinary administrative capability, that the process began with selecting appropriate stone in the Aswan quarries, that the granite had to be free of flaws and cracks, that the cutting was done using copper or bronze tools and abrasives and controlled fire that would heat the stone and allow it to be fractured along desired lines, that the work required months or years depending on the obelisk's size, that transporting the finished monument required constructing special barges and waiting for the annual flood when the Nile's water level was high enough to float the enormous weight, that erecting the obelisk required ramps and ropes and coordination of hundreds of workers pulling in unison, that the entire process from quarrying to erection could take years and required resources that only the wealthiest kingdoms could afford, that the obelisk was therefore statement of power as well as devotion, was proclamation of Pharaoh's ability to command resources and labor on scale that lesser rulers could not match, was demonstration of Egypt's wealth and capability, was monument that would speak not just to the gods but to humans, not just in the present but across millennia. Beneath the silence of the inscriptions carved into the four sides of each obelisk, the hieroglyphs that record the pharaoh's names and titles and his dedication to Ra, that proclaim his piety and his achievements and his divine mandate, that ensure his name will be spoken as long as the stone endures, that make the obelisk into voice that speaks the pharaoh's name to the sun, that proclaims his existence to the cosmos, that guarantees his immortality through stone permanence and through solar association. We can sense the solar theology that made these monuments meaningful. The understanding that the sun was not merely celestial body following physical laws, but was God who required service and who provided life in return for that service, who died each evening and needed the prayers and offerings of the living to strengthen him for the nightly battle that would determine whether dawn would come, whether the world would continue, whether order would prevail over chaos, whether Ma'at would be maintained, or whether Isfet would triumph, and the cosmos would return to the primordial chaos from which it had emerged at creation, from which only the sun god's power and the pharaoh's proper performance of his duties could keep it separated. Where memory fades into the question of why so many obelisks were removed from Egypt by Roman emperors who transported them across the Mediterranean to display in Rome and Constantinople, who saw in these Egyptian monuments symbols of power and antiquity that would enhance their own authority and their city's prestige, and later by European powers in the 19th century who competed to acquire Egyptian obelisks for their capitals, the obelisk in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, the obelisk in Central Park in New York, the obelisk on the Thames Embankment in London, who created what Egyptologists now call Cleopatra's Needles. Though most of these obelisks long predate Cleopatra and have no connection to her except the European imagination that associated anything Egyptian with her famous name, why these monuments to Egyptian solar theology became trophies displayed in foreign capitals. Why the obelisks that were meant to stand in temple precincts now stand in city squares where no one remembers their original context or their original meaning, where they are admired as beautiful objects and as symbols of ancient Egypt, but where their religious significance has been lost, where they pierce not the veil of sky as they were intended to do, but pierce instead the urban fabric of cities that have no connection to Ra or to pharaohs, that have incorporated Egyptian monuments into their own symbolic landscapes, creating strange juxtapositions and displacements that speak as much about imperial ambitions of Rome and Europe as they do about ancient Egypt. We find the obelisks as monuments that have traveled far from home, that have been uprooted and transplanted, that have been removed from sacred contexts and placed in secular contexts, that have lost their original audiences and their original purposes, but that remain powerful presences. The obelisks that pierce the veil of sky pierce it wherever they stand, pierce it in Cairo and in Rome, pierce it in Paris and in New York and in London, pierce it through their verticality and through their association with the sun, pierce it through their inscriptions that proclaim pharaonic names even when no one passing by can read the hieroglyphs, pierce it through their endurance across 3,000 years or more. Pierce it through their testimony to Egyptian solar theology and to the pharaohs who erected them and to the emperors and powers who removed them. Pierce it through being simultaneously Egyptian monuments and international monuments, simultaneously sacred objects and secular decorations, simultaneously voices speaking pharaonic names to the sun and silent stones standing in cities where the sun rises and sets without prayers or rituals or any acknowledgement of Ra. Pierce it through the contradictions they embody, meant to stand in Egypt but standing elsewhere, meant to honor Ra but displayed as trophies or as park decorations, meant to proclaim pharaonic piety but proclaiming instead the power of those who removed them from their original contexts, meant to be read and understood but standing now in cities where no one reads hieroglyphs and where few understand what the obelisks meant to those who carved them. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the obelisks speak through their inscriptions that preserve pharaonic names, Thutmose III and Hatshepsut and Ramesses II and Seti I and others whose monuments stand in foreign lands speak through their verticality that reaches toward the sky wherever they stand, speak through their granite that has endured while softer stones have eroded, speak through their tips that once were capped with gold or electrum that would catch the sun's rays and glow like second sun, like beacon connecting earth and heaven. Like the Benben stone made monumental, speak through everything that makes them recognizable as Egyptian monuments even when they stand thousands of miles from Egypt. even when they pierce skis that Ra never saw, even when they stand in contexts that their creators never imagined, speak through being the obelisks that pierce the veil of sky, that pierce it still, that will pierce it as long as they stand, as long as the granite endures, as long as they remain monuments reaching toward heaven, reaching toward the sun. Reaching toward Ra, who may or may not hear the names proclaimed by the hieroglyphs carved into stone 3,000 years ago, reaching toward the sky that the obelisks pierce, that they pierced when they stood in Egypt and that they pierce now wherever they stand, that they will pierce as long as they endure, the obelisks that pierce the veil of sky. In the cool darkness of temple sanctuaries before dawn, before the sun rose over the eastern desert and began its daily journey across the sky, before the day's activities began in the towns and villages and cities that surrounded the temple precincts, before the noise and heat and light of Egyptian day intruded on the sacred silence of the night, the priests performed the rituals described in the Book of the Hours. Opening the sealed doors of the naos, the shrine within the sanctuary where the god statue resided, awakening the deity with hymns and prayers that proclaimed his majesty and praised his power, purifying the statue with water from the sacred lake and with natron salt, anointing it with precious oils, censing it with incense that filled the chamber with fragrant smoke, clothing it in fresh linen garments, adorning it with jewelry and insignia appropriate to the god. Presenting offerings of food and drink, bread and beer and wine and meat and vegetables and fruits, everything that the god required for his sustenance, performing the elaborate sequence of actions that had been performed every morning for centuries, that connected the present moment to the eternal patterns, that maintained Ma'at through ritual repetition, through ensuring that the god was properly served and that the relationship between divine and human realms remained intact. That the cosmic order continued to function as it should. The daily temple ritual was work in the most literal sense. It was service that had to be performed, labor that sustained the cosmos, maintenance that kept the universe functioning properly. Not optional devotion that could be neglected when inconvenient, but essential practice that had consequences if it was not properly executed, that could bring disaster if it was performed incorrectly or not performed at all. That required trained priests who knew the proper words to recite and the proper actions to perform and the proper sequence in which everything should occur. Who understood that mistake in ritual could be dangerous, could offend the god, could disrupt Ma'at, could bring consequences not just for the individual priest, but for the entire community, for Egypt itself, whose prosperity and security depended on proper maintenance of the relationship with the gods who controlled the Nile's flood, and the sun's rising, and the fertility of the fields and everything else that made life possible in Egypt. It is said that the priests were not clergy in the sense that modern religions understand the term, were not necessarily more devout than other Egyptians or more spiritually advanced or more closely connected to the divine. Were instead temple administrators and ritual specialists who held rotating appointments, serving for 1 month, and then returning to their regular occupations for 3 months before serving again, who were not full-time religious professionals except for the highest ranks, but were ordinary Egyptians who had been trained in the temple rituals and who took turns performing them, who knew how to purify themselves before entering the sanctuary, who knew what prayers to recite and what offerings to make, who performed the service as duty rather than necessarily as calling, who maintained the temples and served the gods because Egyptian society required it, because the system depended on it, because Ma'at could not be sustained without it. Beneath the silence of the daily temple rituals that were performed for thousands of years in temples throughout Egypt, that created rhythm to Egyptian religious life more fundamental than the festival calendar or the astronomical observations or any of the other more dramatic aspects of Egyptian religion. That structured time through their regular recurrence, that made the dawn sacred through ritual attention. That transformed mundane acts like washing and dressing and feeding into holy services that sustained the cosmos. That made the morning not merely beginning of day but renewal of creation. Reenactment of the first sunrise when Ra emerged victorious from his nightly battle with chaos, we can sense the Egyptian understanding of religion as work that must be done rather than as internal spiritual state or as personal relationship with the divine, as practical necessity rather than as optional devotion. As service that gods required and that humans were obligated to provide, as maintenance contract between divine and human realms where both parties had responsibilities and both parties benefited when those responsibilities were properly fulfilled, where the gods provided prosperity and protection and order, and the humans provided service and offerings and proper maintenance of the temples and the rituals. Where memory fades into the last day when these rituals were performed in their traditional form, when the temples were closed by Roman emperors who had converted to Christianity and who saw the old Egyptian religion as pagan abomination that had to be suppressed. When the last priests who knew the rituals and who could read the hieroglyphic texts that prescribed them died without successors, because there was no one left to teach because the temples were closed, and the religion was forbidden and Christianity and later Islam had replaced the old gods with new God and new beliefs and new practices that had no use for the elaborate daily rituals that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia, when the Book of the Hours was read for the last time and the gods were awakened for the last time and the offerings were presented for the last time before the temples fell silent and the statues were removed or destroyed, and the whole elaborate system of daily temple ritual came to an end after having continued for longer than anyone could remember. After having been performed every day without interruption except during the most severe disasters for 3,000 years, we find rupture that is almost unimaginable, ending of practices that had seemed eternal. A closing of temples that had seemed permanent, cessation of rituals that had structured Egyptian life for longer than Christianity has existed, silence that fell when the priests stopped reading the Book of the Hours, when the dawn came without the rituals that had greeted it since the first pharaohs. When the gods were no longer awakened and no longer served and either departed from their temples or remained in the darkness of the sealed sanctuaries, or simply ceased to exist as gods cease to exist when no one believes in them anymore, when no one serves them anymore, when no one reads the Book of Hours anymore. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the priests speak through the texts that describe the daily temple rituals, through the reliefs carved on temple walls showing the pharaoh making offerings to gods, through the liturgical papyri that preserve the hymns and prayers that were recited at each hour, through the archaeological remains of the temples where the rituals were performed, through everything that documents what was once living practice and that is now historical reconstruction. Through the recognition that for 3,000 years priests performed these rituals every morning, that they awakened the gods and served them and maintained through their labor the cosmic order that sustained Egyptian civilization, that they read the Book of the Hours when hours were sacred divisions of time marked by rituals rather than by clocks, when dawn required human attention and human service and human prayers to ensure that the sun would rise. When religion was work that sustained the world rather than belief that saved the soul, when the priests who read the Book of the Hours were reading instructions for maintaining the universe, for keeping chaos at bay, for ensuring that Ma'at would prevail, for serving the gods who required service, who depended on human offerings and human prayers and human rituals to sustain them just as humans depended on divine blessings and divine protection and divine order to sustain themselves. The Book of the Hours that the priests read is not a single book but is a collection of texts, is the accumulated liturgical knowledge that structured temple ritual, is the hours themselves made into reading, is time made into service, is dawn and noon and dusk and night each with its proper prayers and proper offerings and proper actions, is the daily cycle made sacred through ritual attention, is the recognition that every moment required proper observance, that the gods needed constant service, that the cosmos required perpetual maintenance, that the priests who read the Book of the Hours were reading the instructions for cosmic maintenance, for keeping the world functioning, for ensuring that the gods were served and that Ma'at was maintained and that Egypt would continue, that the priests read until they could read no more, until the temples closed and the tradition ended and the Book of the Hours became archaeological text rather than living liturgy. Became document that scholars study rather than instructions that priests follow, became voice from the past rather than guide for the present, became the silence that remembers when priests read the Book of the Hours, when they awakened the gods, when they maintained the cosmos, when they served through reading, through performing, through the daily rituals that sustained Egyptian civilization, that speak now through their absence, through the silence in the temples. Through the recognition that the priests who read the Book of the Hours read no more, that the hours pass unmarked by ritual, that the gods sleep or have departed or exist only in memory and in museum collections, that the Book of the Hours is closed, that the reading has ended, that the silence has begun, that the priests who read the Book of the Hours speak now only through the texts they left behind, through the reliefs and the papyri, through the testimony to what they did when they read the Book of the Hours. When they awakened the gods, when they served the divine, when they maintained Ma'at, when they were the priests who read the Book of the Hours. Among the statues of pharaohs that line the temples and fill the museums, among the inscriptions that record the names of kings and their achievements, among the tombs in the Valley of the Kings where only pharaohs were meant to be buried, there appear occasionally the names and images of women who ruled Egypt, who wore the double crown and the false beard and all the regalia of kingship, who broke or transcended or simply ignored the convention that pharaoh must be male, who demonstrated that women could maintain Ma'at and perform the rituals and lead the armies and build the temples and commission the monuments and do everything that male pharaohs did, who created legacies that their successors sometimes attempted to erase, who left marks on Egyptian history despite efforts to delete them from the record, whose presence demonstrates both the possibilities that Egyptian civilization occasionally allowed to women and the resistance that those women faced from a society that was profoundly patriarchal, that generally excluded women from positions of supreme power, that made the female pharaohs exceptional rather than typical, remarkable rather than ordinary, subjects of debate and fascination rather than simply pharaohs among other pharaohs. Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh for approximately 2 decades during the 18th dynasty in the 15th century BCE, who was initially regent for her stepson Thutmose III, who was too young to rule when his father died, who gradually assumed full pharaonic titles and powers, and who ruled in her own right rather than merely as regent, who commissioned her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri built into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, who sent trading expeditions to Punt that returned with incense and exotic animals and goods that demonstrated Egypt's reach and wealth, who commissioned countless monuments and statues showing herself in the traditional pharaonic regalia, including the false beard that symbolized kingship, whose images and cartouches were later systematically defaced, her face chiseled away from reliefs, her name erased from inscriptions, her statues smashed and buried by Thutmose III, who succeeded her and who apparently wanted to erase her from the historical record, to deny that she had ruled, to restore the succession to its proper Malonly pattern, to pretend that the throne had passed directly from his father to himself without the intervening decades when Hatshepsut had been Pharaoh speaks, still through the monuments that survived despite the attempts to destroy them. Through the temple at Deir el-Bahri that remains one of ancient Egypt's most beautiful architectural achievements, through the inscriptions that preserve her names and titles even where they were defaced, through the statues that were buried but not destroyed, and that have been recovered and restored and displayed in museums where Hatshepsut's face can be seen again after centuries of deliberate obscurity. It is said that Nefertiti, the beautiful wife of Akhenaten who attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion by establishing the worship of Aten, the solar disk, as the exclusive or at least the supreme deity, may have ruled as pharaoh after Akhenaten's death, may have taken the throne name Neferneferuaten and ruled during the brief transitional period before Tutankhamun came to the throne and the traditional religion was restored. Though the evidence is fragmentary and ambiguous, and scholars continue to debate whether Nefertiti actually ruled as pharaoh or whether she remained queen consort throughout Akhenaten's reign and died before him or shortly after him, whether she was the mysterious co-regent who appears in some inscriptions, or whether that co-regent was Akhenaten's daughter Meretate, or someone else entirely, the uncertainty itself is significant, demonstrates how little we know about this revolutionary period in Egyptian history. How much was deliberately obscured or destroyed after Akhenaten's religious reforms were rejected, and the traditional worship of Amun and the other gods was restored. How Nefertiti remains one of the most famous and least understood figures of ancient Egypt, known primarily through her beautiful painted limestone bust that was found at Amarna, and that has become icon of ancient Egyptian art, image reproduced on countless posters and book covers and tourist souvenirs. Face that everyone recognizes even though the woman behind that face remains largely mysterious, her life and her role and her fate all subjects of scholarly debate and popular speculation. Beneath the silence of what motivated these women to seek pharaonic power or to accept it when circumstances thrust it upon them, whether they believed they were restoring Ma'at or disrupting it, whether they saw themselves as exceptional individuals breaking conventions, or as women fulfilling roles that circumstances required regardless of gender. Whether they faced resistance or acceptance or complex mixture of both from the religious establishment that controlled the temples, and from the bureaucracy that administered the kingdom, and from the military that defended Egypt's borders, and from the population whose cooperation was necessary for any pharaoh to rule effectively, we can sense that female pharaohs occupied uniquely difficult position, that they had to justify their rule in ways that male pharaohs did not. That they had to prove their legitimacy more thoroughly because their gender made that legitimacy questionable to those who believed that only men should be pharaohs, that they were vulnerable to having their reigns erased from the historical record in ways that male pharaohs were not except in the most extreme circumstances. That wearing the serpent crown as woman required extraordinary capability and extraordinary determination and extraordinary circumstances that would allow or require a woman to claim what convention reserved for men. Where memory fades into Cleopatra VII, who ruled more than 1,000 years after Hatshepsut, who was not ethnically Egyptian but was Macedonian Greek descended from Ptolemy, the general of Alexander the Great who had taken control of Egypt after Alexander's death, who was last of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since 305 BCE, who spoke Egyptian fluently unlike most of her Ptolemaic predecessors who had remained culturally Greek, who claimed to be incarnation of Isis, and who styled herself as pharaoh in the traditional Egyptian manner, even though she also ruled as Hellenistic monarch, who used her intelligence and her learning and her political skill to maintain Egypt's independence as long as possible against Roman power that was absorbing all the other Hellenistic kingdoms, who allied herself first with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony in attempts to secure Roman support for her rule, who has been remembered primarily for these relationships but who was in her own right formidable ruler, accomplished linguist who reportedly spoke 9 languages, skilled diplomat who negotiated with Romans and other powers, administrator who managed Egypt's economy and who commanded its military resources, who kept Egypt functioning as independent kingdom for 2 decades during period when all the other territories of the ancient Near East were falling under Roman control. We find the last woman to wear the serpent crown, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the ruler whose death in 30 BCE ended the pharaonic tradition that had lasted 3,000 years, who killed herself rather than be paraded through Rome as captive in Octavian's triumph, who died wearing the serpent crown that Hatshepsut and perhaps Nefertiti had worn, who ended the long line of god-kings and god-queens who had ruled Egypt since Narmer, whose death marked the transformation of Egypt from independent kingdom into Roman province, from civilization center into imperial periphery, from pharaonic Egypt into Roman Egypt, from ancient civilization into ancient history. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the queens who wore the serpent crown speak through the monuments they built, through the inscriptions that preserve their names even where those inscriptions were defaced, through the statues that show them in pharaonic regalia, through the temples they dedicated and the trading expeditions they sponsored and the diplomacy they conducted and the armies they commanded, through everything that testifies to their reigns despite the attempts to erase them from history, through the recognition that women did rule Egypt, that they wore the double crown and carried the crook and flail and performed the rituals and maintained Ma'at and did everything that pharaohs were supposed to do, through the queens who wore the serpent crown and who wore it with authority, with intelligence, with determination, with the capability that made them pharaohs not despite their gender but simply as pharaohs, as rulers who happened to be women, as god-kings who happened to be god-queens, as the few women among the many men who ruled Egypt across 3 millennia. As Hatshepsut and perhaps Nefertiti and Cleopatra and perhaps others whose names have been lost, or whose reigns were so brief or so contested that they left few traces. As the queens who wore the serpent crown that was Pharaoh's crown regardless of Pharaoh's gender, that symbolized the uraeus, the cobra goddess Wadjet who protected the king and who spat fire at Egypt's enemies that marked the wearer as Pharaoh, as god-king, as ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, as maintainer of Ma'at. As the one who stood between divine and human realms, as the pharaoh who wore the crown, the women who were pharaohs, the queens who wore the serpent crown. Beyond the narrow green ribbon where the Nile flows and where life concentrates in villages and fields and cities that cluster along the river's banks. Beyond the black land that the annual flood once renewed, and where Egyptian civilization flourished for 3 millennia, beyond the irrigation canals and the palm groves and the temples and the tombs that mark the boundary between cultivation and wilderness, the desert extends like eternity made visible, like silence made landscape. Like absence that defines by contrast the presence of life along the river, like the red land that made the black land precious, like the realm of Set, the god of chaos and violence, and the desert itself, like the domain of death where the Egyptians buried their dead because the dryness preserved bodies as the moisture of the black land could never preserve them, like the chaos beyond Ma'at, like the wilderness beyond civilization, like the emptiness beyond the fullness. Like the desert that is simultaneously hostile and essential, threatening and protective, destroyer and preserver, the force that buried cities under sand and the force that kept those cities intact beneath the sand, the environment that made agriculture nearly impossible and the environment that made mummification possible, the red land that surrounded the black land, that defined it, that gave it meaning through contrast, that made the Nile's gift visible through showing what existed where the Nile's water did not reach. The desert remembers everything, every footstep that crossed it in ancient times when caravans traveled from the Nile Valley to the oases, and from Egypt to Nubia and from the Red Sea coast to the interior, every tomb that was cut into desert cliffs or built on desert plateaus where the dryness would preserve the mummies and the grave goods, every temple that was constructed at the desert's edge where the boundary between order and chaos was most visible. Every quarry where stone was extracted for pyramids and temples and obelisks, every mining expedition that ventured into the eastern desert seeking gold or into the Sinai seeking turquoise and copper, every caravan route marked by the bones of animals and occasionally of humans who did not survive the journey, every artifact buried by sand and preserved by dryness and waiting to be discovered by archaeologists who continue to find new sites in the desert, who use satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to identify structures buried beneath the sand, who excavate tombs and settlements and fortifications and quarries that reveal new information about ancient Egypt, that demonstrate how much remains undiscovered, how much the desert still holds in its silent vastness. It is said that the desert preserves what the Nile Valley destroys, that the humidity and the cultivation and the continuous occupation of the black land have obliterated most of the ancient remains in the areas where people live, that the temples and tombs that survive along the Nile are exceptions rather than the rule, that most of what we know about ancient Egypt comes from what was built in the desert or at its edge, from the pyramids at Giza and Saqqara and Dashur that rise from the desert plateau, and from the tombs in the Valley of the Kings cut into desert cliffs, from the temples at Karnak and Luxor and Abu Simbel built at the boundary between cultivation and desert, from everything that the desert's dryness has preserved while the black land's moisture has destroyed, from the recognition that the desert is Egypt's great archive, that it holds the evidence that allows us to reconstruct ancient Egyptian civilization. That without the desert's preservative power we would know far less about the pharaohs and their achievements, about Egyptian religion and art and architecture and daily life, about everything that the monuments and the tombs and the papyri reveal. Beneath the silence of the desert floor where archaeology continues to discover new sites even after 2 centuries of intensive excavation and exploration, where ground-penetrating radar reveals structures that are completely buried and invisible on the surface, where satellite imagery identifies ancient roads and canals and settlements by detecting slight differences in soil composition or moisture that indicate where humans once built and lived. Where entire cities and cemeteries remain to be excavated because the desert is vast and archaeologists are few and resources are limited, and much of the desert has never been systematically surveyed. Where the sand holds secrets that have not yet been revealed, but that wait in the dryness, that wait in the silence, that wait to be discovered, or that wait to remain hidden forever, buried so deeply or located so remotely that they will never be found. That will remain mysteries that the desert keeps. We can sense how much has been lost and how much has been preserved, how the desert is simultaneously graveyard and museum, destroyer and curator, the force that has eroded monuments through wind-blown sand, and the force that has protected those same monuments from the humidity that would have destroyed them completely. Where memory fades into the future when climate change may alter the desert in unpredictable ways, when rising temperatures may make it even more hostile than it has been, when changing precipitation patterns may bring rain to areas that have been dry for millennia or may make dry areas even drier, when shifting sands may cover what has been stable or may expose what has been buried. When the desert that has preserved ancient Egypt for thousands of years may begin to destroy what it has preserved or may reveal what it has hidden or may simply continue as it has continued. As the red land beyond the black land, as the silence beyond the voice, as the emptiness beyond the fullness, as the desert that remembers everything, we find that even the desert's gift is contingent, that preservation is not permanent, that what has survived 3,000 years may not survive 3,000 more. That the monuments and tombs and artifacts that the desert holds may eventually be destroyed by the forces that have preserved them, that the sand that covered and protected may eventually abrade and destroy, that the dryness that mummified may give way to moisture if the climate changes, that the desert itself is not eternal even though it seems eternal, that everything changes eventually, including the desert, including the silence, including the red land that surrounds the black land, including the emptiness that defines the fullness. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the desert speaks through its silence, through its vastness, through its preservation of what the cultivation destroyed, through the monuments that rise from its sands, through the tombs cut into its cliffs, through the mining sites and quarries and caravan routes that mark its surface, through everything that testifies to human presence in the inhospitable landscape, through the recognition that the desert was essential to Egyptian civilization even though it was hostile to Egyptian life. That the red land defined the black land, that the chaos beyond Maat made Maat precious, that the death in the desert made life along the Nile sweet, that the preservation in dryness made possible our knowledge of ancient Egypt, that the desert remembers everything even though it seems empty, holds everything even though it seems to hold nothing, preserves what seems lost, reveals what seems hidden, speaks through silence, testifies through emptiness, is the red land that the black land depended upon. That Egyptian civilization required even as it feared it, that was Set's domain and Osiris's domain simultaneously, that was chaos and preservation, death and memory, emptiness and fullness, silence and voice, the desert that remembers everything, that holds ancient Egypt in its sands, that preserves the monuments and the tombs, that keeps the secrets and sometimes reveals them, that is simultaneously hostile and essential, threatening and protective, the red land beyond the black land. The silence beyond the Nile, the emptiness that defines the civilization, the desert that remembers everything, that holds everything, that preserves everything, that speaks through its silence about ancient Egypt, about the civilization of the Nile, about the monuments that rise from desert sands, about the tombs cut into desert cliffs, about everything that the desert remembers, everything that the desert holds, everything that the desert preserves, the desert that is Egypt's memory, Egypt's archive. Egypt's silence, Egypt's emptiness, Egypt's red land, the desert that remembers everything. The end.